Alright guys, we're going to create a UI in Unity. We're going to be creating a music player for a mobile app, and it's going to be responsive and work on any mobile screen. So first we're going to get familiar with Unity. How many people here know what Unity is? How many people have used Unity before? Good numbers, okay. So we're going to go and get familiar with Unity. So if you've never used Unity, this will get you up to speed. And then we're going to create a music player example using lists, scrollable views, buttons, and we're also going to make the UI dynamic. Unity is a 3D cross-platform real-time rendering engine. It's used to create a lot more than just games. You can create a VR, AR. It's the standard for virtual reality and AR. Over 60% of all augmented reality apps are using Unity. You can export to over 25 platforms, so you can just build it on one platform and export to any platform you want. There are restrictions if you want to use like iOS services for your mobile app and Android. You can set up separate coding, separate platform dependent coding, so you can compile certain code for a certain platform and compile it for another platform. 50% of mobile games are using Unity, and it's quickly becoming one of the fastest growing jobs. So jumping into Unity, this is the layout that you're going to see once you open up Unity. Here on the bottom is the project. This is going to show you all the files that are within your project. Next is the scene. This is kind of like the level. If you're making an app, the scene is going to show you all the UI objects, and you can move them around and scale them around. Hierarchy shows you all the objects inside your scene. That red, blue, and green arrow is a game object that I've selected, and it shows me where it is in the scene. It's just an empty game object, so there's nothing there except for the arrows, and that's for the transform component here in the inspector. So in the inspector, it shows you information about the object that you have selected. So if I selected the script below in the project file, it would show me information about the script in the inspector. And if I click on like some folder, it'll show me information about the folder. But here I've selected an object from the hierarchy, which is within the scene, and it shows you the properties that are on this object. And Unity works in a component-based system, so the transform is one component, and you can add more components, which are going to be your scripts. So these scripts that I created below, I would be able to drag it onto that object, and it'll appear as a component. We're not going to go too far into, we're not going to do any programming at all in this workshop. At least that's not the plan. I just wanted to go over what the terminology is for Unity. We're going to be using components, but they're going to be already made by Unity, so it's not going to be like this example component that I've added. And Unity also allows you to save game objects, so you can save like a skeleton of game objects. Let's say you had a, for example, in this project, we're going to create a scrollable view, and each object inside of that list object, inside of that list scrollable view, is going to be its skeleton. So it's going to contain information like the name of the song, the artist, the time length for the song, and it's going to be a button. So if you click on the button, it'll send an event to your music player and tell it to play that. To make a prefab, you drag it to your project, and then you save that game object as a object in your project file, and you can drag that object back into any scene, and it'll be the exact same thing. And to edit the prefab, you have to edit it directly from the project, because if you edit it within the scene, it won't save across all the other prefabs. So you just have to make sure that you're consistent with that. So that was kind of a lot. and I don't expect you guys to have that memorized. So we're just going to go over it slowly and recreate and learn Unity by making a UI. So first off, let's create our project. So you open up the Unity Hub, or if you don't have Unity Hub, you can open up the Unity Editor directly and start a new project from there. But go ahead and create a brand new project. Make sure to select 2D, and you can name the project Workshop UI or Music Player or anything like that. And the difference between 2D and 3D in Unity, if you have it to 3D, when you import textures and things like that, by default it'll import as a texture. And if you use 2D, it'll import as a sprite. And the differences between those, I'll go into it a little further. But the sprite lets you, it's more for a 2D object, and for a texture, it's for something that maps onto a 3D mesh. 3Ds with extras are some extra components that Unity has, like post-processing, and they have some other shaders that come with it too. And high definition and lightweight rendering are kind of experimental rendering code that Unity's doing. If you use them, you can't use any other shader except for shaders that are designed specifically for either HD or lightweight rendering. So let's create our 2D project. And I already have one created here. So let's go back into the Google slide while everybody's project is being made. So UI in Unity requires a canvas game object. Just like that empty game object that we made, Unity has an option to create multiple varieties of game objects. So if I go here into Unity, go into my hierarchy, I can hit create, and I can create things like a cube, cylinder, capsule, tree, terrain, ragdolls. Let me create a sphere really quick. And go out of 2D mode. And let me also create a cube as a ground. And here on the right side, you can see that this game object, the sphere, has a mesh renderer and a sphere collider. The mesh renderer takes in a mesh from the mesh filter. It gives it materials and handles all the lighting for you. And the sphere collider will handle any physics for you. And if I add a rigid body to this game object, this gives you physics. So you can change things like mass, drag. You can also add constraints, so you can restrict movement on a particular axis. And if I hit play, the cube just falls down. And if I were to tilt, it's a little hard to see. It's not falling. There we go. So yeah, it's really easy to just get started and create anything in Unity. But we're going to be creating a canvas object, and in Unity, all your UI game objects, they require a canvas parent, and that's used to just render the canvas. The canvas runs on a separate renderer, so you have to make sure to use the canvas render. That way Unity knows that it should be rendering. Events, the event system is also a component on the canvas, and that handles events. So whenever you move your mouse, the event system is tracking where your mouse is, and it's sending out ray casts. So it's basically just sending out like a line to wherever your mouse is and looking for any objects that it can collide with, like buttons or like scrollable views or anything like that. So let's go ahead and create a canvas and some example text. Does everybody have their Unity project open and created? Does anybody not have their project ready? All right. So if you right-click into Unity in the hierarchy, select UI, Canvas. This is going to create a big rectangle on your scene. And if I go back into 2D, you can see it a little better. If I right-click on the canvas and select UI, Text, I created a text object as a child of the canvas, and if I go into the game, I can see the text here in the game view. And in the game view, you can set up aspect ratios. We're going to set up an aspect ratio for mobile, which is going to be 9:16. Make sure to select the type aspect ratio. And 9:16 is the most common aspect ratio for mobile devices, mostly Android phones. So this is going to give us a vertical view. And here, if I click on the canvas game object has 3 components on it by default. The canvas, canvas scalar, and graphic raycaster. Every canvas has a graphic raycaster. It tells the event system to how it should cast the rays onto the canvas by giving it the dimensions of the canvas and where things should lie. The canvas scalar is for creating UI that scales with your screen. So if I change it from constant pixel size to scale with screen size, I can give it a reference resolution. So I can give it 1920 by 1600, for example. And all my UI will try and fit that resolution. And I can specify it to either match the width or height. So if you have long screens, you're going to want to match the height. So if you're doing desktop, anything desktop or anything console, you're going to want to match height. And if you're doing mobile, you want to match width. Or you can also scale it with constant physical size, which is also nice for desktop. Or if you have a specific device size and you know exactly what it's going to be, then this is probably what you want to use. But otherwise, scale with screen size. You can set the reference resolution to the aspect ratio also. Sorry. Sorry. All right. So for the canvas scalar, we're going to be using 200 by 600 to scale the UI, and we're going to match with width for this example. Next up, the canvas. You can change the render mode to screen space overlay, screen space camera, and world space. Overlay won't apply any effects to your UI, and if you use screen space camera, it lets you specify what camera to render on, so you can render UI specifically on a camera, and it'll also take in post-processing effects that are on that camera. Or you can use world space, and that's for UI that's going to be in 3D. So if you have like a house and then you have your front door, you can put up UI on that front door and show like a person's like profile and their username. But we're going to be using screen space overlay. And we're not going to be doing anything else to the canvas or the canvas scalar. And the event system here, you have to make sure that you have the standalone input module. And what that does is take in input for desktop, so like your mouse clicking and your keyboard clicks. It'll also work by default for mobile. And the event system, you don't really need to use it at all. So next up in the UI, UI has presets that you can set up, anchor presets, and this lets you kind of attach UI to a specific side of the screen. So if you have like an app that goes from iPhone to iPad, and then you suddenly expand the width, you want something to stick on the left side. So if it's like the scroll bar that comes off to the side that gives you the options, that should be anchored to the left side, or like on the upper right for your profile picture. Or you can also set up UI to stretch. That'll be for things like headers. Make sure to always use the inspector when you're moving UI and not dragging it around in the scene, because it ends up with inconsistent numbers and then you get like floating points and then things end up like being close but not exact. And once it's on the device, you can kind of figure out what's not exact. So let's go over the anchor presets and pivots inside of Unity. So here, its anchor preset is set to center. What that does, if I change it to free aspect and let it render however, it's going to stay attached to the center. But notice how it's a little bit off to the left. That's because they have the text objects, and you can align it to the center or you can align it to the sides. And the sides are going to be dictated based on its width. So if I go into the scene and select this, so I'm going to put it to the left alignment, and let's say I wanted the text to stay attached to the bottom left. I would change the pivot from 0.5 to 0, and if I click here in Unity on the top right where it says pivot or center, if I select pivot, this is the position where objects are going to be moving, and if I rotate from the pivot, this is exactly the pivot position. And you can change, the pivot is a percentage from 0 to 1. So if I set this to 1, it's on the right side, 0.8 and 0.2. So I set it to 0, and I want Y to be at 0 as well, because I want it to be on the very bottom corner. And here I'm going to change the anchor preset to the bottom left, change position X to 0 and Y to 0. And now it's going to stay attached to the left side of the screen, no matter how I scale it. And you can do that. We can create a bottom bar by selecting stretch along the horizontal axis along the bottom. And now you can see that now instead of getting position X and getting width, I get left and right. What that means is how many pixels from the left side of the parent it should render. We'll get more into the parents in a second, but if I change this from 50 to 0, it'll attach to the left side, and I can go -50, or I can go like 25, and same thing with right side. So if I wanted to stretch it along the bottom, like I wear a bottom bar, I would do that, and change the height of the bottom bar to like 30. And because it's stretched along the bottom, it's going to be anchored to move with the bottom side of the screen. Let me change the pivot to be attached to the bottom edge. And now if I set the position to 0, it's exactly at the bottom of the screen no matter what. And the text, you can notice, it's now hidden behind the image. The sorting order for UI is based off its order in the hierarchy. So the text is above the image. If I move the text below the image, now it's in front. And it scales with it too. So let's go back into 9:16. And let's make this bottom bar a little black. And expand it to 80 pixels. And let's delete this text. This is what we're going to be aiming to create, by the way. This music player, it just shows a list of all the songs that it has, the name, the artist, the length. Below here, if you have a song playing, this thing is a separate object completely, and you can have it pop in and out depending on whether something's playing or not. And these are all buttons along the bottom and a button on the top. We'll also be using an icon pack that I made for everything that has these play icons and this and that image fill. So download that pack right now.
So like the game view is like the phone view?
Yeah, it's the device view. Yeah.
So when you transform that image earlier, is it going to scale along whatever the ratio is?
It's going to scale with whatever ratio you set this reference resolution. I am blanking on what resolution I need.
Yeah,
So it should be whatever 9:16 is, or whatever mobile device you're testing on, and then it'll change based on whatever device is rendering it, and it'll try and yeah. So once you download the pack, it should be a zip, and inside the zip is 2 PNG files. Drag this into your project view, or within Unity you can go to Assets, Import New Assets, and select the assets themselves, but that's slow. There we go. Once you have them, and you select them inside of Unity, inside your project view, in the inspector, it shows the properties for this. And as I said earlier, the difference between 2D and 3D when you import a texture, it's going to change it to default if you're in 3D. And if you're in 2D, it's going to change it to Sprite 2D and UI. Sprite 2D and UI is only sprite renders if you're making a 2D game, or UI objects need a sprite and UI, and they can't use a default texture. So make sure your textures are sprite. And we're going to change the icons. If you Do you need the link? UCF UIWS workshop. All right, so in the icons, it's 9 icons. The way to separate them in Unity is to change the sprite mode from single to multiple. And if you open the Sprite Editor now, after you apply the settings, oh my god. So you need to install the 2D package to change this. So go to Window, Package Manager, and it'll open up this package window. And this is where Unity has like their own assets by default. So you can download their post-processing assets here. And there's a UI extension called Text Mesh Pro, which gives you a bunch of more tools with text. For example, if you wanted to set up inline images, so you have instructions like press E to interact or something like that, and you have like an E icon, you can put an icon within the text, and it'll render right there, which is nice for if you have like console input and you want to show like the X button, then you can set that up using inline images, but it's only available using the Text Mesh Pro asset. So it's going to be loading the assets, and once it updates, select the 2D sprite and select Install. Yeah.
What should we do if it doesn't appear in the package list?
Does it say loading, or does it not appear at all?
It just says no results for 2D sprite.
You might not be running on a version that before a certain version, the 2D tools were already included in Unity. So if you click Sprite Editor and it opens up without an issue, then it should be already installed.
Where's that?
If you click on your sprite that you imported in the project view and go to your inspector on the right side, it's loading 1 second. Here it is. So here on the right side, I have my inspector and I have the icons. I changed sprite mode to multiple. And then once you open up the Sprite Editor, now you should get this new window, and I can close the package window. Is anybody not here yet? Alright, so now that we have our Sprite Editor, we can hit this drop down on the top left and expand it. It should be the slice drop down. And what this does is slice up your images, and you can change certain settings. So if you have a sprite, pack with all your characters' animations, like their running animations, you can slice them based on their cell size. Or you can just set automatic here and just hit slice. And Unity is going to add a border around everything, and it's only white, so it's kind of hard to see. So if you click on the top right, this RGB setting, it'll allow you to go into alpha mode, and you can only see things that are not transparent, and it'll add anything that's not transparent a white outline. and you can see exactly where your icons are. And if you select on one of these, it shows you the settings for it, and you can change the borders, for example, pivots, and other things. So by default, the pivot's going to be in the center. This is where you're going to be rotating things. If you had a gun, you would set the pivot to like the handle, and then that would be where it rotates. But for everything, we're going to be setting it to the center for this. And we can rename these icons by clicking on it and just typing in a new name. So let's rename all our icons so we know what they are. Play, pause, favorite, stop, replay, options, audio, and previous and next. And you have to make sure to hit apply, otherwise your settings won't save. And you can close out of there. And if I select this arrow next to the icon texture, it'll open up and show you all the sprites that are attached to it. If I do the same thing with the slider, it'll show you just the slider because I haven't changed the sprite mode to multiple, so it should just be that single sprite. So let's go ahead and create our play button. First, let's rename this image to bottom panel. And this image has no sprite, and that means it's just going to render a white background, a white rectangle, and you can change the color settings here. So I'm going to change that to black and add a UI button. Now if I go into the scene view and try and move the button around, this is the button. And if I hit play in Unity and click on it, you can see it changes color. So let's see what's doing that. Here it has the button component, and it also has an image component. So this image is the white image behind it, and by default Unity has a image for buttons. It's the UI sprite, and it has like a little edge to it. And below this is a text object. And this is just like our previous text, but you can notice it's set to stretch all along, so it's going to stretch as big as the button size. We don't have any text on our buttons, so we're going to be removing that. And click on the button and add the play button to that image. And it's stretched out, but if you set preserve aspect enabled, this is going to preserve the aspect ratio of your sprites. So no matter what your height is, no matter what any of your things are, it's going to look nice. This is good for if you have like if you have an app and people upload pictures to it and they're not always consistent resolutions, and you want to make sure that the aspect ratios don't like mess up. You would make sure to toggle preserve aspect, and it'll scale it based off that. I'm going to change the width though to be consistent with the height, and I'm going to set that both to 40 by 40. And you can notice the button is set to center, and if I completely center this object in the X, Y, and Z, it's here in the very center of this bottom panel. And that's what I meant by parents. So this is going to fit the parents constraints, and this is if I select the rectangle tool here on the top right, top left, I can see the rectangle of what I'm selecting. And if I select the bottom panel, this is the rectangle, and I can edit the rectangle and it'll still say stay centered. But if I wanted the button to scale down, I would change it to stretch on the Y. And now if I scale this, now it'll move and scale with it. Let's rename this button to play. And going further through the UI, you can see that the button also has a button component. And it has an option for whether or not it's interactable. If you check this mark off, it's going to mean that you can't interact with the UI. If I check it off, you can see that the color changes. That's because of the transition effects. So whenever buttons get interacted with, they can get highlighted, pressed, or selected. And if interactable is marked as false, then disabled is just going to overtake. Let me turn that back on. And you can change different transitions. So you can do like a sprite swap. So whenever it's highlighted, you can change the image. Or you can do an animation. So if you had a specific animation, you can tell the animation player to play the highlighted animation. And it can be as something simple as like a repeating, like jumping up and down animation. Yeah?
How do you get the play button to be like a child to the bottom panel, yet still in front?
When you right click, let's say I right click and create a button here. And here it's a child of the canvas. So I drag it over the bottom panel. And because it's a child, it's going to be rendering in front of it. And because it's below it in the hierarchy. But if I were to move this button behind the panel, it'll come up behind here. Next up, let's duplicate this play button and let's make our previous button. So if I press F2 and select the object, you can rename it. We're going to change this to stretch on the left side because we want it to snap onto the left. And we're going to change the pivot to 0. So it's going to move to the left. And let's change this source image to the previous icon. Change the position to about 10. And decrease the width to 30 by 30. And change top and bottom to 25. It looks a little blurry, and if you select the texture, the icons texture, and select generate bitmaps, and select apply, now it looks a little better. What that does is create different versions of the same sprite at a lower resolution. That way it doesn't look like you're rendering a full HD picture. It'll render like a 32 by 32 icon or like a 64 by 64. So let's duplicate the previous and let's call it next now. Oh, and select all your buttons and make sure the transition is back to color tint. And on our next button, let's attach our next icon. Change the stretch to right aligned. And we also want to change our pivot here to 1 because it wants to be on the left side. And position to -10. So now we have 2 buttons both on the left and right side that are going to be anchored to the left and right side. Next up, let's create our header bar. And this is going to be containing like the title of the app and the options button. So let's create the same thing that we did for the bottom panel, an image. Let's call this top panel. Make sure you move it out of the bottom panel and make it a child of itself. It can either be below the bottom panel or above it. It doesn't really matter. But change the scaling to be stretched along the top and change left and right to 0. Height to 60. Height to 50. And change the color to black again. And pivot to 1, so it's along the top. And position to 0. So now it's attached to the top of the screen. So now if I go into Unity in the game view, this is what it looks like right now. Let's right click on our top panel, create UI text. And this is going to be the title of the app. We can change the text color so it's more visible on a black panel to white. And change this to music player app. And I also want it to stretch the full distance. And I'm going to change the left to 70, or 60 is better. Top to 0, bottom to 0, and right to 0. And I'm going to change the alignment to be centered along the Y. Does everybody have, does anybody not have this? Does anybody need me to go over any other objects that we set up? Awesome. Let's copy and paste our previous buttons that we made. And this is going to be for the options button. So I copied and pasted it from the bottom panel. I selected the play button, selected copy, or you can copy it here. And when you paste it, you need to paste it on the object that you want it to be parented to. So if I paste it here on the text object, let me delete that button. If I paste it while selecting the text button, it's going to paste it into a child of the top panel. But if I select it using the top panel and paste it, it's going to paste it into the canvas. Let's change the play button text, play name to options. Add the options icon. And we want this to stretch along the left of the top panel. And let's change the top to 20, or bottom to 10 and top to 10. Change the pivot along the X to 0, so it's left aligned. And let's add an offset of 15. So this is how our top panel looks now. So here we have our music player and the options. Now let's create a scroll view. And the scroll view makes it easy for you to create scrollable containers that contain a lot of data that you can just scroll through. If I hit play here and just mess around with the scroll view, you can see it lets you move up and down if you click on it and drag. Or you can also interact using this scroll bar. And if you notice, when I'm out of play mode, there is a horizontal scroll bar. If I go to the game object on the scroll view and go to the component scroll rect, it lets you specify whether or not you can move horizontal or vertically. It lets you specify horizontal and vertical scroll bars, and it lets you specify visibility. You can change it to auto hide and expand viewport. What that does is just hides the scroll bar, so that horizontal scroll bar wasn't visible, but the vertical one was, because there was a certain height that it couldn't see. So it displayed the vertical one, but it didn't display the horizontal one. And if you select expand viewport, what it'll do is expand the viewport past this horizontal bar, so it'll display anything below it. But as soon as you need that horizontal scroll bar, it'll move it back up. So we're not using a horizontal bar at all. So let's open up the scroll view, and inside you can see viewport, scroll bar vertical, and horizontal. So let's select our horizontal and delete. Select the delete key, or you can right click and select the delete. Now our scroll bar, if you go into the game view, it has that little bit of offset. What you have to do is, Unity doesn't realize that there is no horizontal scroll bar yet because this scroll rect hasn't updated it. What you have to do is mark horizontal as false, or just update any variable inside of this component. And now it'll recognize that you can change this, and now you can modify what it's set to. And you can change the width. By default, it's aligned to the right side, so whatever you set this to is going to work. Let's set the width to 5, and the position to -5, or -2. And that creates like a little small scroll bar, and it looks pretty good. You can also change the color of the scroll bar. So let's change it to a little gray. And the sliding area, this is the white bar that changes based on how far you are along the scroll. And you can change the color for that too, and you can also add a sprite to it. I'm just going to be using a gray. And now let's expand our scrollable view to take this whole, the whole height of the app. So let's change it to stretch on all dimensions. If you remember, our top panel has a height of 50, and our bottom panel has a height of 80. So if I go to the scroll view, I want it to be 50 units from the top, so it'll be exactly below that, and 80 units below or above the bottom, and it'll be above the bottom bar. I can change the color of this for the background. I'm going to change it to a darker color and increase the opacity to full. You can make UI objects transparent, so you can render things behind them. And I'm also going to change the source image. Unity's using a like a border view, but I want it to stretch along all of it. So I'm going to select none, and it's going to change it into a rectangle. And now I can finally go ahead and add things to the scrollable view. So if I go into the viewport and content, this content is what specifies how far the scroll area should go. If I decrease the size here in Unity, you can see the scroll bar is updating as you are increasing the size. So what you can do if you wanted to create a long text, like you have a huge paragraph of text and you just want to display it, what you can do is attach a content size fitter onto your text. Select preferred size, and on content, you're also going to add the content size fitter and select preferred size. And that the content size fitter is fitting the contents of this, and it's updating the size, the height of this text object to match the contents. So if I got rid of all this, the height is now 15. And if I add more lines, the height starts increasing. we're going to be using the content size fitter, but we're not going to be using text. We're going to be creating a list. So let's create a UI button. And this is going to be the button that we have here. And it's going to show the song name and the song length and the artist. So let's go into our button. And you can see here, we can specify width and height. But we don't want that. We want it to automatically create more buttons as we duplicate this and just place them along the app, just like we're doing right now. Unity has these things called vertical layout groups and horizontal layout groups or grid layout groups. Let's click on our content. We're going to leave our content size fitter on our content object, and we're also going to add component vertical layout group. So if I go into Unity here, now if I duplicate this button, now it's going to start laying them out. And you can see that the content size fitter is adjusting the size based on how many buttons are inside. So let's delete all those buttons. And let's go to our content and vertical layout group and change control child size to true for width. And what that's going to do is change the width of the button to match the width of this object. So if I wanted to, I can change the right and left. All right, so that little offset on the right side, it was because I hadn't updated the scroll recs and it was locking the content from being resized. So now that I changed it, now I can change the right to about 8, and that looks right. So now I have a button on here. Let's change the text here to say our example song name, and we're going to move it to be stretching along the horizontal axis, and we want it to be left aligned. Let's add a left padding of 10, and let's duplicate this, and let's call this artist name. And let's rename our previous text to song name. And here on our artist name, I can right align it, change the font size to about 9, and move it a little bit to the bottom. Add a right alignment. Move it to about -6 and duplicate this and call it song length and change it to like 455 and increase the font size to 15, and let's move this up a bit, and there we go. So if we were to make this, if we were to code this, we would get our button, change it to song button, and create a prefab. And then I would drop this here. And if we wanted to display our songs, we would create a script that would find all the songs that we have, spawn this prefab as a child of this. So if I were to do that, just spawn it here and drop it in. Now it's added. And for every song, we want to create a new object. We'll have all the objects that we need. And then we'll go on that object, on that prefab, find the song name, the artist name, and the song length, and update all those text values to be accurate to the song that we're trying to display. So now that that's done, let's create our bottom bar here. And this is going to show us the length of the song that we're currently playing, the name of the song, and the artist name. But we don't want this to pop up. always. We just want it to pop up when you're playing a song. So let's create a new panel for that. So let's create a new UI image. Stretch it along the bottom, along left to 0, right to 0, height to 25, or height to 30. You want to pivot it along Y0, so it's aligned to the bottom. And we want it to move 80 units above, so this would be above our bottom panel. And for now, I'm going to leave the image with a white background, but once we're done, we're going to disable this image, and we're not going to use it. But for now, we're going to leave it on so we can see the scale and to match the sliders and the text with this container. So let's create our slider. Select create a child image of that image, and let's rename the image that we made the song playing banner, and let's rename the image to the song length slider. And I'm going to change the sprite source image to our slider that I made, and I'm going to change it to stretch along the horizontal from left of 50 to right of 5, and a height of about 8. And let's change the color to green. Let me add a more offset to the right to show the song length. And let's duplicate this and call this the foreground and make it a child of the slider. This is the actual slider part. Let's go to our previous slider and make it a little darker. And go to our foreground and change image type to filled. Change fill method to horizontal. And this is going to let us set up a fill amount for our image. And what that does is modify how much of the image we're filling. So this is the image itself, but because I have that background image, that's what's showing on the background. And here if I increase and change the fill amount, it shows. And you want to make sure that it's set to stretch along the entire size of the background, so that when you update the size of this, it'll move with it. Next up, let's create our text for current time. And we're going to set this to like 1 minute 50 seconds. Left aligned, left pivot, horizontally centered, and we want to move it to the left of about 10 pixels. And let's change the color to be brighter, because once I get rid of that white image, it's going to be that black background. And let me duplicate the current time also and change this to end time. And this is going to be the end length of this song, so change it to like 455. Change it to be right aligned, right pivot, and about -5. And you want to also right align text so that it's on the right side. And we can decrease the font size. And now it should fit in the in there. And now if I get rid of the banner background, now it'll show here. Let me move that some more, -10, and change the slider to 40. And finally, I just need the artist name, or the song name. And I'm just going to duplicate the current time text that we created, move it up a bit by about 30 or 20. Set the song name. And the artist name. And I'm going to do the same thing, right align it. And right align. So now, how are we going to get this object to go behind the banner when we don't want it to display? We have to first move it behind the bottom panel, but we also want it to be above the scroll view. So what we're going to do is move the scroll view up and move the song playing banner so that it's below the bottom panel but above the scroll view and above the top panel. And now if I move it up and down, it hides behind the bottom bar. And you can set up an animation or a script that so if a song's playing, it'll set the position to 80, and if it's not playing, it'll set the position to like -30 and hide it. And you can smooth that position out so it like pops out smoothly and goes back down. But that's how you'd set up the initial positioning, and then you create your animations or your scripts, and then you would modify that position. That's about it. There's some more buttons like this like button, the replay button, and the audio button. They're just duplicates of these buttons and just placed around the bottom panel. So it's not that big of a